a microphone.
There we go.
Here, we'll move so you can sit here.
I was gonna say, I just can't.
It's okay.
I was
She really doesn't want to.
The front row is really far away, so it doesn't really count as a front row.
You're so weird. Oh, it's mine.
No, you're fine, you're
I
fine.
got a mountain head kind of. Yeah.
No, it's okay. I see one that.
Well, good evening, both to the folks in the house and to the folks watching virtually. I'm Chris Kleindienst. I own the bookstore, and it's really nice to see you here and imagine you out there also watching. It's kind of an extraordinary evening. I don't get to introduce one of my coworkers as the author of the evening, and it feels really special. Really special. I should say, before we get started, that the best way to ensure that events like this keep happening is to support the author and the bookstore by purchasing their books from the bookstore that is hosting the event. And when you do this, you support your community several-fold, because we invest in the community, both in our jobs here in the store and all the taxes we pay and all of the other organizations we support and all the stuff we all do with our own paychecks when we go home. So it's a win-win-win-win-win. We have a lot of events all the time. Our event calendar never says no, and most of them are just pretty fabulous. So the best thing to do is to get on our website and sign up for our e-newsletter. You can also just go on there and check our event page, or you can take a look at our social media, especially Facebook. Everything gets thrown up there. So yeah, if you like this, you'll probably like something we're doing later this week or next week, because there's always something right around the corner. We're going to have a conversation, so, and Mark is going to read a little bit as well, and then there'll be time for some questions, both from the virtual audience and the in-person audience. Virtual audience, be thinking about that. You can type them in whenever they occur to you, and we will get to them. I wrote a few remarks to start this off. So I don't remember when I officially met Mark. He probably does. I do remember, what I do remember is that he approached me at our downtown location, Rest in Peace, and recruited me to be on the board of the Missouri Center for the Book, for which he was serving as president. The board was about to launch the Missouri Poet Laureate program, and Mark generously thought that I would be a good person to help choose a poet. He was very persuasive with his proper and thoughtful approach, his crisp tailored attire and snappy chapeau, but it was his off-the-cuff erudition that sold me. It was impressive and more than a little intimidating. Even though I do not consider myself versed in poetry, see what I did there? I managed to overcome my imposter syndrome and agreed to serve. So as luck would have it, Mark found himself in approximately 2012, we were doing some math, at loose ends job-wise when photography digitized, and I was at least intelligent enough to offer him a job at Left Bank Books, where he contributed in myriad ways to this enterprise, for which I am eternally grateful. He continued to impress me with his off-the-cuff erudition to the point where I felt we should start a mini podcast called Ask Mark Anything. We have not yet started this podcast, but it can still happen. He also continued to be a highly disciplined writer, systematically churning out and submitting manuscripts. He retired from the bookstore about 1.5 years ago to devote himself full-time to his writing. And even though I miss him popping over from the used books buying office to my office to regale me with a little-known story that some falling apart book he was handling had reminded him of, usually about an obscure author I pretended to know, because Mark will always know more stuff than I could ever hope to. I'm glad for him and for us that he did retire from bookselling. Because tonight, we celebrate the publication of Mark's new novel, his first mystery. He is back in the game. So we're going to have a little chat, but first, please give a warm welcome to Mark Tiedemann.
Oh, shucks.
I'm going to ask you to speak into the
I will
microphone
speak into the microphone.
for a few reasons. One of them is our virtual people.
Hello,
Um,
virtual.
You're not real.
They're not real. Of course, the sci-fi fans here would address that.
They may not be real, but they count.
Let's start with, can you tell us the story behind how this book came to be to begin with? Because I think you were not at first intending to write this.
No, I was not. I was working on an alternate history, which was set in St. Louis around 1928. And I changed the timeline sufficiently that I thought I needed to know what part of the history of this town I was in fact changing. So embarked on a lot of research. I went all the way back to the founding to see where the departure point would be. And by the time I got done writing the alternate history, I sat back and I said, you know, I think I could write a fairly decent historical novel from all this. And little bit by little bit, I got sucked into the idea of setting an actual historical mystery in the period, because there are so many books set during the Revolutionary War along the Mississippi. I thought, well, maybe somebody might be interested in one more. And
Are there really so many books?
no, this is absolutely,
Just checking.
as far as I can tell, except for academic works, this is an untapped theater of drama and fiction. And so I started working on this one. And one thing led to another. That then leads into the writing process, which is like making sausage, and you don't want to hear that. Because it's just, how did I come up with what? I have no idea. But I thought I would be clever and tie it to as many actual historical people as I could find. There was no one named Ulysses Granger. However, the brother Gideon was a real person.
So,
The family was from Connecticut, and the Granger family was prominent at that time, and Gideon Granger ended up being one of the first postmaster generals in the state of Connecticut. And I just invented a brother for him to write letters back and forth.
okay, so you've answered all my questions. But actually, let's back up,
Okay,
because I'm thinking most people here haven't read this yet. So Granger is actually our protagonist. And he arrives in St. Louis in approximately 1780.
right.
First of all, I'd like you to describe like how he found himself there. And then, also, can you tell us a little bit about St. Louis in 1780? Because I knew nothing of this setting. I learned a lot. So maybe give us just a little bit of a set the stage.
It was technically a village. There was probably around 800 to 1,000 people. It was a trading community because it was near the Missouri River, and south it was, the confluence in the south, and the boats came by. It was at that time Spanish territory. France had ceded it to Spain after the 7 Years' War. And it is the site of one battle in the Revolutionary War.
Called
The
Battle of St. Louis.
the Lanne de Coup
Oh.
is what they called it. The British were going to come down and take it because they wanted to strangle off the Mississippi and prevent the American rebels from using any of that. And Spain was an ally of the nascent United States, and said, well, we'll back you. We will keep this territory from falling into British hands. The French who lived there were not so sanguine. They were merchants for the most part, and the prominent citizens of the community wanted to cut a deal. And the Spanish governor said, no, we are allies with the Americans, we will fight. And so there was a day-long battle. It was a two-pronged attack. There was an attack on St. Louis, and there was an attack on Cahokia across the river at the same time. And it's ostensibly a British attack, but one of the amusing things I found out was that there were exactly 2 British regulars on the field. There was a major and a sergeant. Everybody else, all the other combatants, were Indian tribes that they had made deals with, and a bunch of disaffected trappers and traders who had grudges against St. Louis. And of course, St. Louis had its own allegiances with various tribes, the Osage in particular. And they had a one-day battle, and it ended in a rout. They didn't want to fight for it that hard, and they left. They kept waiting for a second shoe to fall, but that never happened. My hero was there attached to, let me get this right, George Rogers Clark, who's the brother of William Clark, and he ran the local militia. And I sort of kind of invented the position for Granger and his friend Ham, being seconded to the militia from the Continental Army under Nathaniel Greene. So they were there ostensibly as observers and get caught up in it.
Wow. So, one of the plot kind of hinges on something an enslaved person tells someone else that there's, and I was curious about this just historically. What happened was before that battle, which they knew was going to happen, there was a call from the Spanish Lieutenant Governor of St. Louis to bring in your people into
They wanted
town.
everybody to come into town. It was in many ways very much like a medieval castle. When there was going to be a battle, you got everybody inside the castle walls. They did the same. They didn't want anybody hanging out there. This was a little bit controversial when I wrote it because there wasn't a lot of evidence that there were very many people outside the confines of St. Louis, but I recall stumbling on an article that some archaeology had been done outside of the town and found homesteads, the remains of homesteads 10, 20 miles outside of St. Louis, which was new information. And yeah, there were people who were working outside of town. So yeah, they bring them all in, get everybody inside. They had built bastions, and there was a big wall that they had built, and they were ready for a siege, and they brought everybody out. The incident that you're referring to is one of the slaves points out that there was still somebody out at this one place.
Right.
And nobody who takes him particularly seriously, but Granger's friend decides, I'm gonna go check. And he doesn't come back. And that starts the plot.
So this is, how did you touched on this, that you decided it was you had somehow enough material to write a historical mystery. Like, how did you know mystery? Like, why not just a novel? This is a very specific, genre, and it definitely works as a mystery. It is definitely a mystery. It is a page turner, at least for me, once I got used to all the military terminology at first.
This is to keep me interested in it. It's in fiction, it seems like there's nothing like a dead body that perks up everybody's interest immediately. As soon as the corpse is on the floor and somebody finds it, we want to know what that's all about. So you can just about, I think, do anything else you want to do as long as that's part of what's driving the plot. People will read it. And I think I wrote a more a fully fleshed novel around the mystery, because there's a lot else going on in there. I hope I successfully pulled that off. But I had to get Granger back to St. Louis, because he gets sent back east after the battle. And
But you sent him back east.
yeah, I sent him back east. Well, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but I wanted the war to be over, so
Gotcha.
that he could, I'm not a soldier anymore, I'm here as a private citizen, and I'm here to do this thing.
So what, did you know, what was gonna happen? Did you know who did what when you started?
No,
No.
No.
Because it's got a lot of complex turns and, just things going on that are like, there's, like any good mystery,
mhm,
everyone has a secret.
Yeah.
And some of the secrets are worse than others, and they just get there, and you're like untangling the knots of all these secrets as you go. And it's
paid in place in the West.
yeah, definitely. There's definitely some love interests in this story as well. But so you were kind of figuring it out as you went.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the first novel that I published was in fact a mystery. It was set in Isaac Asimov's robot universe, and the first. So I'm writing this thing, and the editor that I had at the time kept making me give him a more and more detailed outline, to the point where when I had a 28-page single-spaced outline for the book. And I called him and I said, Howard, why should I write the book now? I now know everything that's going to happen. I don't care anymore. But that was his work process, and we changed editors, which was fortunate, and then I threw that outline away and I wrote a completely different book. Because I write to find out what's going to happen.
And I would think it would be easy to paint yourself into a corner. That's what would happen with me.
It's very frustrating, but it's also the most fun place to be. Because now you have to write your way out of the corner.
Okay.
Yeah. This is the part that nobody sees, this is the sausage making. And how many pages get thrown in the trash because you painted yourself into a corner and then put barbed wire up and you can't get out of it. So you throw that away and start over. But yeah, I write to find out what's gonna happen. Because if I'm surprised, hopefully the prose will surprise the reader. It'll show.
Interesting. I think if I tried to do it quite like that, it might show how disorganized it was.
There's actually a technical term among writers for that. It's called being a pantser. You fly by the seat of your
Oh,
pants.
geez. I wasn't,
You were going somewhere else with that.
I wasn't sure. So you talked about, you touched on this with Granger, that you blend real historical characters with fictional ones. So, Shoto, and I never hear we say Gratiot, but I'm pretty sure. Gratiot is what, yeah. Labadee, those names pop up, and then, his real historical things like the Battle of St. Louis. And we were talking before, just before now, and you mentioned that one of the really important other character was a real person. I just wondered, can you talk a little bit about your people who are actually characters in your story? How you, just like some of them were actually historical figures.
Yeah.
So,
How do I do that?
yeah, talk about it.
Well, if they've got a full biography available, which most of these people do not. Some have better biographies than others, but there's lots of gaps, and you have to infer a great deal between the lines when you're reading about some of them. What were they actually like? What kind of people were they? And you can make inferences based on what they actually did, what kind of character they had, what they were willing to do, and how successful they were at whatever they tried to do, and who they were associated with. will tell you a great deal, and how they were associated with them. Who their enemies were and why. And then a process, like baking a cake starts and the character emerges. I doubt that my characterizations are in any way bringing these people authentically back to life, but I don't think I did anything that ran afoul of historical reality with them.
Yeah.
I mean, you can make assumptions about some people just based on how many books they had in their house. Particularly since at that time, that was an incredibly expensive thing, not just to buy, but to ship.
Mhm.
So what did they have in their house? What did they read for pleasure? That would say quite a bit about people.
That they even knew how to read.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Or,
Because all the names you mentioned were essentially the 1%.
yeah, of course,
Yeah.
those, the figures that probably most people would recognize.
Mhm.
And they don't really show up. There's one kind of walk-on of one of the Shoto family members.
Yeah, there's a party in the book, and some of them are on display, and he proposes a toast. He's one of the lesser Shotos. You don't hear a whole lot about Kate Shoto, but.
So one thing that's, I imagine was challenging was you set this in a period and a place where some of the people you're writing about are enslaved to some of the other people you're writing about.
Mhm.
And how did you approach that? What would, obviously had to deal with it.
First, you try to humanize everybody. And by that, I mean getting into the heads of the people on the ground at the time. How would they actually feel about this on both sides? And then trying to be true to that characterization. Most of these people did not think they were themselves bad people for owning slaves.
Right.
And so they would not be walking around always self-conscious about the fact that they were doing something wrong. It was just daily life. The slave situation west of the Mississippi at that time, because this was French/Spanish territory, the laws were quite different. Some of it surprising. Slaves often had rights that slaves in America, in the United States, did not have and would never get. And then, as you pointed out earlier, it can be confusing when there are free people walking the streets who in Georgia would be in chains, just based on their skin color. But here they're free, and the laws were, as I say, quite fluid. It made for an interesting encounter when the United States actually started moving into the territory after it was purchased. Because a lot of the Americans were encountering, for the first time, free blacks who were carrying guns. And it led to some terse moments, probably exacerbated the conditions that ultimately ended up in the Civil War, and you can make of that what you will. But I try very hard when I'm writing my characters, especially if they're pertinent to the plot, to get inside the heads of these characters. Now, to a large extent, that's impossible. I'm not that person. And it's even more impossible when you're writing at 200 years remove, because it's like visiting another world. And these people just felt about things in a completely different way. Some similarities, obviously, but I did not, as much as I would personally disapprove of the situation, I did not want to ruin the reality of the narrative by bringing my own sensibilities into it anachronistically. Yeah.
Yeah. You talked about world building earlier when we were chatting, like the world building you do in science fiction, and said something about how setting a story in a historical setting was a bit the same.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, writing historical fiction and writing science fiction are to a great extent the same set of muscles that you have to use. You have to recreate a world that you don't live in. You have the benefit of being able to make it up from whole cloth when you're writing science fiction, although that's deceptive because it has to be true to the way people would live in a society. You can't just simply go off and say anything that you want and build anything that you want. It has to be self-consistent. And the further back in history you go, you're visiting another world. You don't know how the Romans actually felt about things. I thought, and everybody here seen the series Rome on HBO? I thought they did an absolutely astonishing job of stepping out of a 20th century mindset and getting us deep into what would have been current in 40 BC in Rome at that time. And some of it is really uncomfortable. They were making decisions and passing judgments that you just look at, what is that all about? And nobody batted an eye because it was normal. So to that extent, I think that writing historical fiction is not that far removed from writing science fiction.
Did you ever feel tempted to kind of bend the history that you knew going into this? That did it become inconvenient little pieces of it?
No, I mean, in order to conform to a plot structure, you leave things out that don't relate to the plot. But no, I thought sticking to what actually happened was the best way to do it. You can find what you're talking about. You can find this kind of problem with somebody like James Michener, whose books are so authoritatively written. You think, oh, this really happened, and no, it's a complete fabrication. This did not happen. But if it had happened, it would have happened that way.
I feel like I try to make those excuses to my parents sometimes.
There's that. But no, I've never been, personally, I've never been tempted to bend history. If I can't set my story against a certain event, then I'll find a way to either not talk about that event or I'll set it someplace else. Or I just do more research until I can find a way to put what I want to write into it.
So you have a very, the characters in the story, speaking to that a little bit, the two main, well, really 3 or 4 now that I'm starting to add them up, women characters who are important to the plot are pretty strong and pretty independent, and also their own agents romantically and sexually. Were you ending history or
Not really. Frontier rules kind of take what they can use and leave the rest behind. There's been a couple of collections of letters from frontier communities that I've gone through of various sorts, and you find out immediately that with the second generation, all the rules go out the window because they're so far removed from the parent civilization that they find themselves having to make it up as they go along. And for about a generation or two, it's social chaos, and then things reassert. And they often reassert differently than what they left behind. But conformity and rigidity reassert. But the reality of the village of St. Louis was that there was a dearth of women. Only about a third of the population was female. A lot of guys without partners. A lot of tension in the air, no doubt, even though they didn't write about it particularly. And now, a good chunk of that population was migratory. They were trappers, they were traders, they weren't always in town. But they had, Madame Chateau is a case in point, because there were a set of laws and rules that dictated what women could and could not do, and she broke every damn one of them. Because nobody was gonna say no to her. She owned the property, she was sitting there at the time, she had the rifle across her lap, metaphorically speaking. Nobody was gonna take any of that away, so she called the shots for years, and after a while, nobody batted an eye. Even the lieutenant governor would often go to Madame Chateau to talk things over. How are we gonna deal with this? And
yet
It
there were still laws though, because
Yeah.
the one character, her husband dies and she loses her home to his sons who do not live there and are by another
by his
woman,
first wife,
his
right?
first wife.
Yeah.
Because she cannot legally inherit that
Right.
property.
Right. She would have been able to do it had she had a child with her husband.
Mhm.
He could have inherited, and she would have been the proxy,
Right, she still wouldn't have inherited, she just wouldn't have had.
but she wouldn't have had to leave.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting also, also the way you've been describing St. Louis at the time, it feels like nothing much has changed. I was struck by that also because there's a lot of firing of muskets and rifles in this book, and people get shot and they're digging these giant metal things out of their shoulders and so on, and it just is like, St. Louis has had a problem with gun violence kind of from the get-go.
Yeah. I mean, it sprang up periodically. There was less of it than you might get from my story because I'm pumping the drama.
Right,
Okay.
it's
But-
a mystery and there's bad guys.
There are bad guys, and they dealt with their bad guys rather, but of course they had limited constabulary. There wasn't a regular police force. If somebody shot somebody, then a bunch of townsmen would get together and go find them and whatever. They would bring him before a magistrate more often than somebody living in Georgia would. But, it was very rough and ready, and they settled things out in the woods quite a bit. There's a character that I would like very much to write about who shows up later in St. Louis's history, is a guy named John Smith T, who the T meant Tennessee. There were several John Smiths in town, so they would add little things to their names to differentiate themselves from each other. And John Smith T was a true hard ass in the strictest sense of the word. And he had committed murder, he had committed theft. They wanted to arrest him and put him in jail. He shot 2 of the Martians that came after him, and nobody would go near him after that. I said, not worth it.
So that leads you to bringing this out, that this is not a one and done standalone. You've got a plan for more. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I originally, now you got to bear in mind, I wrote this novel 10 years ago. So great thanks to my new publishers who rescued it from obscurity and decided to put it out. And when I wrote it 10 years ago, I laid out a very ambitious plan of 10 books going from 1780 to 1821, all following the same character up to statehood. I thought that would be a good place to end it. So yeah, I had put pins in various pieces of period research along the way. I don't know that I've got the energy to write 10 books now, but I hope to do a couple more at least.
Well, I hope you do too, because I kind of got attached to some of these characters and I'd like to see some more.
Martine continues all the way through.
Fantastic. Martine rocks. So, I think, I haven't been following the time, but I'm wondering if you could read a little bit from the beginning of the book so we can give everyone a flavor of
Okay.
what they're in for. And then we have a little time left for some questions.
Okay. So I will start at the beginning, see what you think. Chapter 1. Ulysses Granger first saw the Cortez house from the saddle of an unfamiliar horse. It was pretentious, with aspirations evident in a second story and the makings of a broad front porch. Someday it might be a grand house, but for now it labored beneath a mantle of incompleteness. It stood at the crest of a low rise at the end of a wagon track that came out of the woods a dozen yards to the right of Granger and his three companions. He did not see his future, only the place where Ham had gone missing. If anything has happened to Ham, he thought, I'll have someone's hide. He held his irritation in check, but it was a struggle, especially after the river crossing. Granger hated open water. All the way across the Mississippi in a canoe between two natives of the Fox, he kept trying to remember the Lord's Prayer. The Lord is my sergeant, he had muttered. The Indians, if they had heard, had ignored him. Once more on dry land, he recalled the entire prayer effortlessly. Naturally, when I no longer need it. A year in the Army had knocked much of the boyishness from him, but he still had to work against his youth and the anxiety of not looking foolish in front of more seasoned men. He was 20, but sometimes felt much younger. He wore his authority awkwardly. He blamed Ham for going missing and his French and Spanish hosts for losing track of him, but he bit back the impulse to say anything, hearing Ham's admonition, "Don't always lead with your mouth, Oddie." Oddie, Ham's nickname for him. Granger disliked it intensely. Ham was the only one he allowed to use it. But just now he wanted more than anything to hear his friends say it. A trio of crows erupted from the trees on the far side of the clearing, circled, then dropped lazily back into hiding. Sweat trickled down Granger's spine beneath his woolen uniform. He shifted in the saddle and looked at their guide. Lieutenant Tiedemann of the St. Louis militia had removed his own scarlet coat a couple of miles back and sat in shirt sleeves and buff vest. Perspiration slicked his young face and darkened the fabric around his armpits. The sun was nearly noon high, and June of 1780 was only a couple of days away. No breeze relieved the heat. "Well," Granger said. Tiedemann sighed. His left hand rested on the hilt of his sword. A pistol hung holstered below the pommel of his saddle, and a musket rested against his back. "It should be deserted. Senor Cortez is on his way south with dispatches for Saint-Geneviève. All his slaves were brought into the village before the battle. Except, Granger had been told, one of them claimed someone was still out here, which was the reason Ham Inwood, his friend, his sergeant, had come back out to be sure, alone." Granger glanced at the other two men. He had to decide what to do next. He ignored the moil of uncertainty, licked his lips, and straightened. "Russell, Taylor," he motioned for them to circle around inside the cover of the trees. Almost silently, they rode off in opposite directions. Seasoned woodsmen and veterans of the last 2 years of Colonel Clark's campaigns, they made Granger feel awkward and inexperienced, as if he should follow their lead instead of commanding them, feeling he also kept rigidly in check. "I am sorry for the inconvenience, Lieutenant," Tiedemann said. Beneath his accent, his English was excellent. "You've already apologized, Lieutenant," Granger said, pleased at the steadiness of his voice. "No need to keep doing so." Granger adjusted his sword belt and checked the powder pad on his rifle, trying not to fidget. Then he heard the bird call signal. He still did not know what bird it was supposed to be, but he had learned the call soon after he and Ham arrived in Cahokia a month ago. He resettled his three-cornered cocked hat and urged the mount forward. His nerves danced as he left cover. The buff turnouts of his blue coat made fine targets from a distance, but no shot came. He envied experienced men like Taylor and Russell who seemed unbothered by danger. He knew it was a mask, but he envied their ability to hide their fear, perhaps in time if he lived long enough. Halfway across the treeless field, he saw a large barn on his right, perhaps 30 yards northeast of the house. Topping the rise, Granger spotted Russell emerging from the trees far to the left, almost directly across from where he had begun. Close up, the house appeared even more unfinished than from the tree line. Windows flanked wide double doors. One door stood open by several inches. Russell joined them as they made a circuit around the house. The stable stood just northwest, a split rail corral enclosing a large area behind it. Taylor was dismounting before the entrance, musket in hand. Directly north was a row of shacks, slave quarters. The only evidence of agriculture was a substantial garden just behind the main house. Whatever Cortez was doing here wasn't farming. Horses, someone had said. Lieutenant, Taylor called, something's dead.
So we've got time for some questions. Would anybody, or comments, would anyone like to pose one? Sarah?
Just yell.
Here. Thank you for being so thoughtful.
We have someone here.
Not yet.
So I feel like there was a little bit of a plot twist to this event, finding out that this book was written 10 years ago. It's like brand new, major change in your genres. Is this largely the same book you wrote 10 years ago, or were there more changes in the
No.
editing process than the
It has evolved. It has evolved. And I tip of the hat, I will always credit editors for the job they do. They don't get enough credit, I think. I worked with some talented people at Amphora to put this together. Their observations were instrumental in changing some of this and making some of it more focused. But yeah, it's a bit different than it was 10 years ago. For one, it's got a new title.
Well,
The original title was The Spanish Bride.
oh, this is a better title. Granger's Crossing.
Call it about.
Does this mean you're not gonna write science fiction at all anymore?
Are you kidding? Oh, God, no. I've actually been having a little mini renaissance of short fiction. I've been publishing short stories in analog for the last 2 years, to my complete and utter dismay for anybody who's into science fiction. I never thought I'd be an analog writer, and now.
Why not?
Because when Stan Schmidt ran it, he wanted technical pieces rather than actual fiction. At least that's how it seems. Now there's a new editor, and hey, things are different.
Things change back again.
I'm sorry?
Any other questions?
And by the way, the alternate history that was the original font of this is still looking for a home.
So all you publishers in the room.
Don't worry, Mark.
Huh?
Don't worry.
Any other,
You do any historic short fiction? I mean, all your short stuff has been science fiction.
I have written a couple of pieces. There's a story, when you decide to buy books, so you should buy them all, by the way. There's a short story collection up there called Gravity Box. There's a couple of pieces in there that are, in fact, historical pieces.
Okay.
There's one that's set during the abdication of Edward right before World War II. And I tie it in with Robin Hood and Arthurian peace, you know, the country is without a king.
Cliff?
So you said earlier that there are tons of pages in the trash from this.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you tried to make work but couldn't? Anything that you wish you had been able to shoehorn into the book? Anything that was a cool set piece? Give me something.
Give you something. I did actually want to write a scene where there's a reference in the book where after Granger has left St. Louis, the Spanish organized an expedition to St. Joseph to take over a British fortress, a fort that was in St. Joseph. And they marched however far that is in the dead of winter and actually captured the fort. And it's just kind of a cool set piece. It ended up being kind of a pointless victory because the British didn't have any reason, they weren't going to keep it. But they did that, and then they all came back feeling really, yay, we did this. And I really wanted to write a fuller description of that, but there was just no way to do that since Granger was already back east. And And there was also a longer section set in Philadelphia when he's getting ready. I had another character, had introduced his translator, because part of the plot, he finds a bunch of letters in this house. They're all written in Spanish. So he takes them. And when he gets back to Philadelphia, he has them translated by a student. And I vaguely recall wanting to keep this guy in the series because he would have been an interesting intellectual tool to the whole thing, but he gets the translations from this guy. That just, it was self-indulgent, and that went in the trash.
Anyone else? Well, as Mark alluded, we have many copies of all of his books at the counter, and he will be happy to autograph them for you and chat. So thanks once again.